May 28, 2000, Mississippi State Penitentiary, the place they call Parchman Farm. 2 men, 1 hacksaw blade, gone. And the craziest part? They didn't escape from just any prison. They broke out of Unit 32, the supermax within the supermax, the place where Mississippi sends men it wants the world to forget. Roy Harper was serving 88 years for armed robbery, no chance of parole, ever. John Woolard was doing 2 life sentences for murder and kidnapping. Neither man would ever breathe free air again, unless they found a way out. But this isn't just a story about cutting through bars and climbing fences. It's about the 19 days that followed, the elderly couple they terrorized for a car, the high-speed shootout on an Indiana highway where a fugitive fired a shotgun at a police officer, and the manhunt that stretched across 6 states before it was over. They escaped from a prison surrounded by 18,000 acres of swamp, land so brutal it could kill a man before the guards ever could. They bought hacksaw blades from a corrupt guard for $40. This is how 2 of America's most dangerous inmates broke out of the deepest hole in the prison system, went on a crime spree across 6 states, and proved that when you take away all hope, desperate men do desperate things. Who were Roy Harper and John Woolard? And what kind of place was so terrible that 2 men would risk their lives to escape it? The answer lies in one of the most notorious prisons in American history, a place with roots so dark they stretch back to the days of forced labor and exploitation. The Mississippi Delta stretches 200 miles from north to south, 87 miles at its widest point, a vast expanse of marshy floodplain. And within this landscape lies something far more sinister. The Mississippi State Penitentiary, Parchman Farm. What kind of place makes even hardened criminals pray they never see its gates? The oldest prison in Mississippi, Parchman's roots are deeply entwined with the dark history of the American South. In 1901, the state purchased what was once a farm, a place where black men, ensnared in an exploitative work program, were forced to build their own prison, a prison that would become a living nightmare. The 2,500 inmates within its boundaries knew escape wasn't just difficult, it was nearly impossible. Even if you made it past the razor wire fencing and armed guard towers, you'd still be trapped. The Delta itself was a natural cage, thick mud, oppressive heat, and mosquitoes so large and relentless they could drain a man dry in a single day. But at the heart of this fortress lay something even worse. Unit 32. The supermax, the hole within the hole, the place where Mississippi sent the men it considered too dangerous for regular maximum security. What kind of hell awaited inside those walls? Unit 32 wasn't just a prison, it was a relentless assault on human decency. Rapes and stabbings were nightly occurrences. Mentally ill prisoners screamed through the darkness. Sewage flooded the cells. Summer temperatures pushed past 120 degrees. Inmates were locked in their cells for 23 hours a day. 1 hour of yard time. That was it. No air conditioning, no ventilation, just concrete walls, radiating heat like an oven. Men went mad in those cells. Some smeared their own waste on the walls. Some screamed until their voices gave out. Some simply stopped talking altogether. A federal judge would later describe Unit 32 as an incubator for violence and mental illness. The unit housed murderers, psychopaths, and high-threat escape risks. It was surrounded by a double-fenced kill zone. Guard towers with shoot-to-kill orders circled the perimeter day and night. The walls of Unit 32 were built to crush any thought of escape. But Roy Harper saw them differently. To him, they were a dare he couldn't resist. Roy Harper wasn't just a prisoner. He was a thinker, a strategist, a man with a detailed, keen mind who had already broken out of an Arizona prison back in 1983. That first escape earned him a reputation, but it also earned him something worse. When guards recaptured him, they made sure he understood the cost of defiance. The torture that followed only made Harper more determined. He arrived at Parchman in the early 1990s, sentenced to 2 consecutive 44-year terms for armed robbery, 88 years without parole, the equivalent of a death sentence delivered 1 day at a time. What drives a man to risk everything when the odds are impossible? Most prisoners in Unit 32 accepted their fate. They served their time in 23-hour lockdown, watched their sanity slowly slip away. But Harper wasn't most prisoners. From his first day in Unit 32, he started studying the guards, the locks, the routines, the weaknesses. He knew the window would be his first challenge, fortified with steel bars, a cut-proof grate, and a steel frame securing 6 panels of tempered glass, the kind of window designed to make escape a fantasy. But Harper was a man who learned from his mistakes. He knew that to break out, he would need 3 things: money, tools, and a plan. How do you get escape tools inside a supermax prison? How do you buy them when you have nothing? In the dark world of Parchman, corruption was rampant. Guards earned barely enough to survive. For $40, Harper bought himself hacksaw blades from an officer willing to look the other way. $40. That was the price of a prison's security. But cutting through bars was only the beginning. To unscrew the bolts covering the window, he needed leverage, a handle, all while avoiding the eyes of a guard stationed just 20 feet away. Improvisation was Harper's specialty. He broke off pieces of angled iron from a light fixture. Using pencil sharpener blades, he crafted a makeshift wrench. It worked. Harper was making progress, but in Unit 32, nothing was ever simple. A new neighbor moved into the adjacent cell, John Woolard, a convicted murderer and escape artist. Woolard was dangerous, unpredictable. He'd escaped from a Florida prison in the 1980s. During his flight to freedom, he'd shot and killed a park ranger. That murder earned him 2 life sentences plus 5 years. With Woolard next door, everything Harper had worked for was suddenly at risk. The guards would be on high alert. A single misstep by Woolard could trigger a shakedown of the entire tier, including Harper's cell. Should he abandon his plan or recruit his dangerous new neighbor? Harper made a choice. If he wanted to keep his plan alive, he needed to bring Woolard in. Yard time. It was the only chance they had to speak without walls or bars between them. For prisoners in Unit 32, this single hour outside their cells could mean everything. Harper told Woolard everything, and Woolard, without any hesitation, immediately agreed. From that moment, the plan belonged to both of them. Every day they met in the yard, each conversation meticulously focused on their escape. Stage 1. Get through the window. Stage 2. Cross the prison yard and breach the outer fence. Stage 3. Escape the Delta and leave Mississippi behind forever. Each stage required meticulous preparation and a fair amount of luck, especially the part where they'd have to cross the kill zone under shoot-to-kill guard towers. Their first stroke of luck was their cell placement. Both were on the first floor. Once through the windows, they planned to move along a strip of shadow that clung to the walls of the cell block. But the real challenge was the razor wire fence and those guard towers. Could they really slip through undetected? Harper continued working on the window. For weeks, progress was agonizingly slow. The hacksaw blades wore down against the steel. His hands bled from the effort. Every scraping sound felt like a confession. Then one day, the worst possible thing happened. Footsteps. The voice of the director of Unit 32, making an unscheduled inspection tour. Harper's heart pounded. The window cover was off. The hacksaw was in his hand. He was a second away from being caught red-handed. The director walked closer. 5 cells away. 4. 3. But Harper, ever the quick thinker, stepped up to the warden with a confident smile. He started talking, chattering about nothing, hoping to distract him long enough for the danger to pass. The warden, distracted by other raucous inmates down the tier, moved on without noticing the missing window cover. He never looked at the cell, never saw the tool. Harper almost collapsed with relief. Remember that close call? It should have been a warning, but Harper wasn't the type to take warnings. The next day, they were back at work, but Harper quickly realized they'd hit another wall. Literally. The window frame and its mechanism were made of reinforced, cut-proof steel. The hacksaws were useless against it. Was there any way through steel designed to be impenetrable? Harper searched the window for another approach, and soon he found it. The seam of the window box looked different, like it might be made of a softer metal. Harper tested his theory. With careful work, he released the window louvers. With the mechanism disengaged, they could remove the louvers without cutting through the steel frame. Stage 1 was finally complete. They'd conquered the supermax window. But they couldn't just crawl out in broad daylight. Harper came up with his own brand of spackle to cover the cut marks, buying them time until they could make their move. The night they'd been waiting for finally arrived. May 28, 2000. Hot, humid, filled with tension. Harper and Woolard synchronized their escape down to the minute. Midnight, the last cell check. It was now or never. They hung sheets over the fronts of their cells, changed into dark jumpsuits that would blend into the shadows, prepared dummies in their beds to fool the guards for as long as possible. Finally, they tossed their supplies out the window and prepared to follow. Once outside, they pressed against the cell block wall, moving along the thin strip of shadow, step by step, inch by inch. The guard tower was less than 100 yards away. A single glance from the tower guard would end everything. They reached the first fence. Harper pulled out the hacksaw blade. He began cutting through the chain link, as quietly as possible, every snip of the wire sounding like a thunderclap in the silence. 1 strand, 2 strands, 3. The gap grew slowly. The guard tower didn't see them. They slipped through and entered the kill zone, the space between the inner and outer fences, the most dangerous ground in all of Parchman. This was where the shoot-to-kill orders applied. 2 men standing in the open, completely exposed. Harper started cutting through the second fence, his hands shaking, his fingers bleeding from the wire. Vulnerable, one sweep of a searchlight away from death. What if the searchlight turned their way? What if a guard happened to glance in their direction? Suddenly, headlights, a patrol vehicle rounding the corner. Caught in the beams, it seemed like the end. They froze, hearts pounding, waiting for the shout, the gunshot, the bullet. But in another twist of fate, the patrol vehicle passed them by. The driver never looked their way. With one final push, they cleared the second fence and found themselves outside Unit 32. But their escape was far from over. Stage 3 awaited them, getting out of the Delta and as far away from Mississippi as possible. They had until dawn to disappear. So they ran into the night, the darkness their only ally. And then they were out. The Mississippi Delta, past midnight. No walls, no bars, no 23-hour lockdown, no sewage flooding their cells, no screaming in the darkness. Just the thick, humid air of the Delta, just the sound of their own footsteps on soft ground, just freedom. For the first time in years, no one was watching, no one was counting. They could walk in any direction they chose. But the Delta wasn't going to make it easy. The swamp stretched for miles in every direction. Thick mud sucked at their boots. Mosquitoes descended in clouds so thick they could barely breathe. The heat was stifling, even at night. Would the swamp kill them before the police could catch them? But how long would their head start last? Back at Unit 32, the guards were none the wiser. The dummies Harper and Woolard had left behind did their job well. It wasn't until hours after sunrise that anyone noticed something was amiss. A routine breakfast delivery sparked the first suspicion. Harper's tray was untouched. That raised a red flag. A guard took a closer look at the cell and soon realized the horrifying truth. Harper and Woolard were gone. Panic set in. The prison erupted into chaos. A team of riot guards burst into Harper's cell, only to find his decoy lying in the bed and a gaping hole where the window had been. Lockdown was immediate. Sirens blared. The word "escape" ratcheted from the control room to every locked door and radio in Parchman. Harper and Woolard had gained a precious 12-hour head start, a gift that few escapees ever received. 12 hours before anyone even knew they were missing. 12 hours of running while the guards thought they were sleeping. The FBI was quickly notified. Electronic communications were sent to field offices across the country. Harper and Woolard were now fugitives at large, armed and dangerous, considered capable of extreme violence. But even with their head start, the duo knew they were far from safe. Exhausted and sleep-deprived, they slogged through the thick, muddy delta for days. The oppressive humidity made every step a struggle. Swarms of mosquitoes descended on them without mercy. Their bites turned every inch of exposed skin into a swollen, itching mess. Then, over the buzzing of the mosquitoes, they heard it. Voices, distant but unmistakable. A search party was nearby. Harper and Woolard froze, their hearts pounding. They knew that any sound, any movement, could give them away. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. They waited, listening, barely breathing. The voices eventually faded. The search party moved on, unaware of how close they'd come. For a week, Harper and Woolard remained hidden in the delta, moving under cover of darkness, surviving on meager supplies, every step a calculated risk. Their journey eventually led them to Webb, Mississippi, a sleepy rural community about 11 miles north of Parchman. They found a house on the outskirts, isolated, private. It was Sunday, church time. The elderly couple who lived there had just left for morning service. Harper and Woolard broke in. Their hunger drove them to the kitchen, where they devoured anything they could find. The fridge and cupboards were emptied. But it wasn't just food they found. In the pantry, they discovered an arsenal. Pistols, shotguns, boxes of ammunition, a treasure trove of firepower. They armed themselves and waited. When the elderly couple returned from church, Harper and Woolard were inside, shotguns at the ready. The couple walked through the kitchen door, oblivious to the danger waiting for them. Harper assured them they wouldn't be harmed if they cooperated. All they wanted was the car. Terrified, the couple complied. Handing over the keys without a struggle, Harper and Woolard tied them up. Then they were gone, driving off with more than a dozen stolen guns. With a car, weapons, and a change of clothes, Harper and Woolard were finally mobile. Mississippi was behind them. The open road stretched out ahead. All they had to do was disappear. Stay one step ahead of the law. Blend into the vastness of America. But when police rescued the elderly couple hours later, they learned exactly what car Harper and Woolard were driving. A description went out to every law enforcement agency in the region. The hunt intensified across multiple states. Remember those stolen guns? Remember that elderly couple tied up in their own home? Those crimes would add years to their sentences. But Harper and Woolard weren't thinking about sentences anymore. They were thinking about survival. Harper and Woolard headed north, making their way through Arkansas with the goal of reaching the Northeast. They'd seen themselves on America's Most Wanted shortly after the escape. Their faces were on television screens across the country. Their reasoning was ruthless. Head northeast, where citizens were less likely to be armed, less likely to shoot first. But Harper knew they couldn't stay in the same vehicle for long. The car was now marked. Every patrol officer in the South had its description. In West Virginia, they stopped at a motel. They found a man alone. They attacked him, taking $300 in his van, leaving him bruised and terrified. Then they spray painted the brown van blue and slapped on stolen plates. A crude disguise, but it was enough to keep moving. They turned north, heading into Indiana, crossing state lines with every mile, adding federal charges with every border. Would their luck hold, or was their time running out? It was after 2 a.m. on June 14, 2000, 17 days after the escape. Their stolen vans sped onto Interstate 65 heading south, and they passed a Lake County Sheriff's cruiser. Officer Ray Corman noticed the speeding van and pulled it over. What happened next turned a routine traffic stop into a gunfight. Corman approached the van with caution. The driver rolled down the window. "What's up?" Woolard said. Then he pointed a shotgun out the window and fired. Corman dived for the pavement as the blast missed its mark. He returned fire, emptying all 8 shots from his revolver into the van as it sped away. The radio crackled to life. Officer down, shots fired, all units respond. Within minutes, every police car in Lake County was converging on Interstate 65. The chase was on. Harper leaned out the passenger window and opened fire with a shotgun. Blasts echoed across the highway. This was no ordinary traffic stop. It had escalated into a full-blown gun battle on the open road. Cars swerved to avoid the crossfire. Civilians ducked behind their dashboards. As the chase hurtled down the interstate, officers deployed a spike strip, a last-ditch effort to bring the van to a halt. The spikes did their job, shredding the tires, sending the van skidding off the road in a shower of sparks. It careened into a truck stop near Lowell, tires blown, nowhere to go. Harper and Woolard were cornered. It was a standoff. But they refused to surrender. How do you escape when there's nowhere left to run? During the chaos, with sirens wailing and officers closing in, Harper and Woolard kicked open the van doors. In a hail of gunfire, they dashed into the night, disappearing into a cornfield, into the Indiana darkness. For the next 2 days, over 200 officers, including the FBI and Indiana State Police, combed the area. The small towns of rural Indiana were on high alert, locals wary of every shadow. But Harper and Woolard, desperate and exhausted, knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. June 16, 2000, 19 days after the escape, the sleepy town of St. John, Indiana. Harper emerged from the woods, hungry, exhausted, covered in scratches and insect bites from days hiding in the underbrush, walking along railroad tracks like any other drifter. That's when he came face to face with Officer James Tortorilla. Tortorillo had never needed to draw his weapon in all his years on the force, but as he saw Harper approaching, he knew this wasn't just any stranger. This was one of the men every cop in the Midwest had been warned about. Tortorillo kept close to his car, door open, ready for anything. Harper placed his hands on the front fender, considering his options, calculating the odds. But this time, there was no escape. Backup arrived. Harper surrendered without a fight. Meanwhile, Woolard had hijacked another van from a nearby car wash, but his reckless escape attempt ended when he crashed on a rural road and fled on foot. Officer Richard Neal of the Lowell Police Department gave chase. 2 hours later, Woolard was captured in a wooded area west of Lowell. Both men had loaded handguns tucked into their waistbands, but neither offered resistance. They were exhausted, injured from days in the underbrush, finally out of options. 19 days, 6 states, 1 high-speed shootout, countless crimes, and now it was over. The most dangerous manhunt in Mississippi history had come to an end in rural Indiana. What happens when America's most dangerous fugitives finally face justice? Both men were immediately charged with 2 counts of attempted murder, 2 counts of attempted battery, and resisting law enforcement. Additional charges were pending from Mississippi, Arkansas, West Virginia, and other states. The list of crimes committed during their 19 days on the run was staggering. Escape from a state penitentiary, home invasion, armed robbery, kidnapping, assault, vehicle theft, attempted murder of a police officer, charges from 6 different states. In court, both Harper and Woolard said they preferred to remain in Indiana. They feared retribution from Parchman guards for their escape. They knew what awaited them back in Unit 32. The beatings, the isolation, the torture that came with being a recaptured escapee. But Mississippi wanted them back, and Mississippi got them. Harper was returned to Unit 32, the same hell he'd fought so hard to escape. But something unexpected happened next. The escape had exposed something rotten at Parchman. The conditions that had driven Harper to risk his life, the brutality, the neglect, the systematic destruction of human beings. Harper didn't just serve his time. He started fighting back through the legal system. For a decade, he advocated for prisoner rights. He was instrumental in the civil suits that ultimately forced changes to Unit 32. By 2010, after years of legal battles and mounting pressure, Unit 32 was finally closed, condemned for its inhumane conditions. The ACLU called it a victory. The settlement required Mississippi to transfer all prisoners to other facilities. The closure sent ripples through the American correctional system. Other states began reevaluating their own supermax facilities. The question was no longer whether Unit 32 was cruel. The question was how it had been allowed to exist for so long. Studies showed that 80% of the inmates in Unit 32 had been misclassified. They weren't the worst of the worst. They were mentally ill, or drug offenders, or men who simply needed protective custody. Men who had been thrown into a hellhole because the system didn't know what else to do with them. In 2016, Harper's debut novel was published, Shank, Tool's Law, a fictional account of a man escaping from Parchman, written in longhand over more than 1,000 pages, smuggled out of prison piece by piece, page by page, over the course of years. A man who had broken out of prison with hacksaw blades had now broken into the literary world with a ballpoint pen. Today, Roy Harper remains confined. He was transferred to the Colorado Department of Corrections in 2016, far from the Mississippi Delta, far from the swampy plains of Parchman. As for John Woolard, his fate remains tied to his crimes. He will likely die behind bars. But what did their desperate flight actually accomplish? The escape from Unit 32 lasted only 19 days, but its legacy stretches far beyond those desperate weeks on the run. Harper and Woolard didn't escape because they were evil men who deserved to suffer forever. They escaped because Unit 32 was designed to break human beings, to strip away every shred of dignity. When you take away all hope, you create desperation, and desperate men do desperate things. Harper proved something else too, that even from inside the deepest hole in America's prison system, one man with a pen and a purpose could change things. He wrote his book in a cell where summer temperatures reached 120 degrees, where sewage flooded the floor, where screams echoed through the night. He wrote it anyway. And when Unit 32 finally closed its doors in 2010, it was partly because a convicted armed robber refused to accept that his life was over. That's the real story of the Parchman escape, not the hacksaw blades or the spray-painted van or the shootout on the highway. The real story is what happened after, when a man who society had thrown away decided to fight back with the only weapon he had left, his mind. And that brings us to the end of our story. If you liked it, don't forget to like and subscribe, and activate the bell button so you can receive new videos.